Well, unions are pushing a 7% pay rise for almost 2.7 million workers to raise the minimum wage by almost $3,000 to more than $45,000 a year. The government, which will give the Fair Work Commission its recommendation tomorrow, has indicated support for only the lowest paid of those 2.7 million workers. Here's Industrial Relations Minister Tony Burke speaking with Laura Jays here on Sky News earlier today.
The principle that we put forward is that the people who are doing it the toughest on the lowest wages can't afford to go backwards, and that's something that the Fair Work Commission should be bearing in mind.
So let's bring in here Ines Willox, the Chief Executive of the Australian Industry Group. Ines, thanks for your time. You put out a release today basically saying if this wage rise from the ACTU, the recommendation is put through, it could risk a recession in Australia. Is that a bit dramatic or not?
No, Ross, we don't think so at all. There are very clear signs emerging from across the economy that our economy is slowing and slowing quite quickly. It's coming through data, but more importantly, coming through a lot of anecdote from members around what they're seeing and feeling, particularly at the consumer level. So what we are saying is that nobody is denying that there needs to be a wage increase in the upcoming minimum wage case. But a wage increase of this quantum, 7%, well over $50 a week, on what is already the world's highest minimum wage, would be backbreaking for many businesses, and large and small. It doesn't take into account what is going on in the broader economy. It's like union leaders, some of them are standing there slack-jawed with their hand out and not prepared for money and not prepared to give anything back to employers in terms of improvements around skills, productivity, making workplaces more efficient. It's money for nothing that they're after. And that's untenable in the current circumstance. And we have a slowing economy. We have signs that inflation is abating or at least moderating. And if a pay increase of this amount, not just for the low paid as the ACTU traditionally wants, but also for a range of workers on awards. If that was to go through, it would absolutely fuel the inflation fire. We'd be back into pressure for higher interest rates, and it would be a body blow for the economy more broadly, as well as employers in particular.
So is Tony Burke's response more reasonable, and that is to quarantine any sort of inflation-style wage increase for those on the very low wages? In other words, he says it's a few 100,000 people.
Well, that's what's traditionally happened. So the unions have gone into overreach mode again and are demanding much more than that. So what we've always been discussing is around an increase for those on the minimum wage, the very low paid. What happens, Ross, is that sort of becomes the benchmark for both expectations and for negotiations. Now, employers and their employees and their representatives work it out, and we quite often don't get to that level, but that becomes the benchmark of which conversations are based. What the unions here want is a sort of a dramatic escalation of that to sort of push increases of that percentage, 7%, right through our workforce and right through the economy. It's sort of playing the game, moving the goalposts, and it just is not going to be acceptable to employers and should be rejected out of hand by the Fair Work Commission.
Okay, but what is a characteristic of this stage of the economic cycle is that there has been no wage price spiral. There's been a price spiral, but wages haven't moved with them. And certainly workers are having to pay higher prices for accommodation, for food, for transport, for electricity, for gas. These are basics that they can't really avoid. And therefore, what the argument from the ACTU and others is that their living standards are going backwards.
So, Ross, that is accepted that a lot of people are doing it tough. The question is, how do we stop this becoming a prolonged cycle of high inflation and high interest rates? The name of the game here is to get inflation down as quickly as possible so that the interest rate pressure can come off as quickly as possible, both on workers and on businesses, large and small. So yeah, no doubt, it has been a very tough environment. Our point is, if a wage increase of this extent was to go through, it would drive up unemployment. Those who are the lowest paid would be the most impacted by that in terms of unemployment. It would drive up underemployment, and it would increase inflation and interest rate pressures. Nobody's going to go into that commission and say there shouldn't be a pay increase, but at a time when we think we believe that the inflation sort of tiger is sort of being caged again, to then sort of throw more red meat to it is a very silly thing to do. It's sort of bordering on insanity, quite frankly.
All right, then go to that whole issue about recession. Australia's economy is expected to slow coming into later this year, but nobody really is tipping recession. You're saying that this wage rise, if it were to go through, would be the catalyst to tip Australia into recession.
What we're saying, Ross, is that it could well be the catalyst, and nobody wants that. What we are seeing and hearing from businesses who are consumer-facing is that they are seeing changes in consumer behaviour, buying patterns that they haven't seen for a very long time. That then flows back through into business, and they're seeing a very rapid slowdown, particularly between January and March, in terms of what's going on in the economy, and we think that will be reflected in data that's coming up soon. There's probably no doubt about that. The point we're making here is that we need to get out of the scenario that we're in at the moment of high interest rates, high inflation, and potentially high wages. We need to get out of that cycle and make sure that we don't. The point I'd make, Ross, is that 1/3 of the workforce is paid in wage increases, new wage increases every year through changes through enterprise bargaining agreements and the like. That is why you're seeing the data as it is. We would argue very strongly that what is actually going on in the economy isn't reflected in sort of the official wages data in terms of in-house wage increases, bonuses, other payments, other parts of compensation as well. So we think there's more going on in terms of what's going into people's pay packets more broadly than is reflected in the data at the moment.
Willox, it's always great to have you on the program, the Chief Executive of the Australian Industry Group.
Thanks, Ross.